in also some ways of information getting out. We are also seeing, and it's not just in Sri Lanka, but across the globe, there is now greater populism and polarization because of these tools. So how one uses social media is also important, responsible use. And what hashtag generation does is so critical in terms of addressing misconceptions, taking incitement, demonstrating that incitement can be dangerous. So we all have a responsibility here. It's not just being outraged by something. It's not just being outraged by the imposing of emergency or creation of high security zones or arrests under the PTA or the need for having checks and balances or having political accountability. It's also how one uses it. And that gets to the point that all of us have been talking about. There are tools. There is a right to information. There is protest. There are vigils. There are campaigns. The citizen mobilization in that sense has been there very much in the forefront in 2022. But this year, I would say, 2023 is going to be a bigger challenge. Because the economic crisis and what we and many of us have been saying for, we are going to be confronted with it much more. The inequalities, the social, economic injustices. What is it that we're going to be doing is going to be a key question this year. But also in terms of asset declaration, corruption issues, political reforms. Asking the question, is the president genuine in terms of a political solution for the minorities? These are things we as citizens need to ask, but hold our elected representatives also responsible and go a step further. Public officials, the military, let's be very, very upfront here. The military, the defense budget is the highest in this country. Ask the question, in a times of an economic crisis, in a time of a pandemic, why is the defense budget so high as opposed to health and education? So we have to ask these tough questions. We have to use the tools that are available. But we also need to realize these are not going to go away anytime soon. So also sustaining these campaigns. It's not something, it shouldn't be the flavor of the month. How do you sustain these campaigns, but also having that energy? So hopefully addressing some of the questions.
Thank you so much. Upekshi, I think this next question, I mean, anyone is welcome to answer, but I'd like to start with Upekshi. Because elections came up a lot in our discussion and it's sort of up in the air. It's the question on everyone's mind, what's going to happen. And I think a lot was said about elections. I think Dr. Vinya perfectly said that we as Sri Lankans have just become voters. And this question of who owns our democracy often boils down to the ballot box. And then there are also people don't seem to take responsibility for who they vote for, and then we are sort of passive bystanders oftentimes, and then complain about when the government does not treat us well. So with these upcoming elections, especially given the backdrop against which it is happening after 2022, and in a very polarized sort of political climate, what do you foresee, especially with regards to social media and how elections themselves tend to manifest on social media, electoral campaigns? I think since perhaps 2019, 2020, we know the role of social media has skyrocketed when it comes to elections. So any thoughts on that?
Like 2020, I think the social media will play a very vital role. Because as Dr. Vinya said, we have a 23% youth who are equipped with social media devices and they are expressing themselves. But the vital point is this generation educating the rest of the rest of the family? Are the youth in a family, they are very equipped and they are educated and they think critically? Is it going to their parents? Is it going to their neighbors? That is a vital question. So in that case, since we are very emotionally driven society, we turned the elections with Kalaniya Naga. We have turned the elections with a whim of someone who's generated those news. So we have to be careful when we should use social media as a voter education tool. It is very vital. But how we are using it is just as important. Are we fact driven? Or are we tapping into that emotional driven tendency in our society? And I'm repeating myself though, are we speaking in their language? Or are we posting so much information and so much intellectual dialogue that the normal people cannot grasp what they are saying? Are we saying, for example, the defense budget? Are we projecting it? Is that worthy? Is it equal to this one? Is it equal to our? There was a huge hahoo of election budget, right? But when we taken it to account, that election budget is a minuscule amount of our defense budget. So again, then the question rises, are we strong enough to question that in a very intellectual and a very sound way, that the normal people, normal adolescents who will be voting for the first time, would they understand that? Or would they, before 2 weeks of elections, would there be another hahoo about civil unrest, or are we threatened again as a nation? So there has to be a defense mechanism inside the social media campaigns that we are running, that we would be running. So to your question, it is vital, but we have to, as Dr. Vinya said, we have to think out of the box, and we have to think out of our generation also to precipitate this message.
Thank you, Pekshan. Sorry about that. Interestingly, for a panel on democracy, given Sri Lanka's current context, this was very hopeful. I'm sure the audience feels the same way. And I think it speaks to this opening, this sort of environment that we fostered, especially after last year. On that note, I would just like to wrap up this session with my last question for all four of you. I think there's also a lot of discussion about civil society's role in reaching out to the masses. How do we communicate to them this need to be committed to civic responsibility, to improving civic literacy? And we have seen some success, pretty much like success in the last year. Any insights on things that we can do better in actually reaching out to people, to keep people engaged beyond just what we saw last year, to keep them engaged and to make democracy an everyday practice, I think was what one of you said. Any thoughts on that? And I think that is my final question for this panel.
Let me go first then. Last year, what we have seen is a broadening of the concept of civil society. I mean, traditional civil society organizations, CBOs, district level organizations, national level NGOs. I think the civic action went beyond the organized civil society. I think That's an important point. So that realization by everyone, even professional groups, religious leaders, I think that's the strength of a democracy. And I think we should try to further that and also nourish that. So for the first time, we have seen professionals, professional organizations talking about democracy, talking about violation of human rights. And then now they have become silent because they think that speaking those things, even though the reality is still the same, is going to undermine economic development. I think that's a myth. I don't think this country can come out of this economic crisis without strengthening democratic institutions and without strengthening democracy. So the same, sometimes it's disheartening. Some organizations responsible for certain aspects of of the economy who would have taken a different stand last year and now saying that no, don't disrupt, don't have protests because it will disturb the economic recovery or affect tourism. I think they don't know how even the tourism works in the world. Tourism, I think large majority, I mean, we don't have to sell Sri Lanka as a tourist destination because Sri Lanka is so unique. The people, historically, we have developed an image about the country, our country's natural resources, the tourist attractions, the heritage, the history, and all that are enough and more. So you don't need campaigns to attract tourists. What is important is stability and the kind of endorsement by the people and the trust that people have with the government and the governance, and then it will give a impression that there is stability in the country. So for that to happen, I think the government has to believe in the people. So there, I think civic action, as you say, involving the civil society in a very broad sense in promoting democracy is so vitally important. So for that, I think we need to connect with those groups who have been very vocal and redefine their role so that they continue to be champions of democracy, and rather than assigning it to civil society organizations, human rights group, it should be everyone's business, whether it is religious leaders, business community, academia. So I think this is a good opportunity, 2023, let's work on that. And especially all these groups have youth. Youth professionals are there. So let them take the lead and we can assist in terms of, giving whatever the technical knowledge and all that, and also the creativity with regard to social media. Some of the very complex, principles of democracy have been now, some people are just giving in one sentence or a cartoon. I mean, it's amazing if you just study the cartoons. Some of the cartoonists have educated the public on fundamentals of democracy than any other sort of human rights or democracy experts, I think, in this country. So let's look at those practical things which have got Janagata Vechadeva. I think we have reached the people. I think we have to be very creative, and social media, of course, is a very strong vehicle to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Any other thoughts? Yes. So in terms of civil society's role, I think as Dr. Ariyaratne just said, who makes up civil society is now broadened, right? So I think it's important for us to each do our role effectively and not try to do too much in a sense also. So if we look at how we fix these issues, each person has to be doing their role well. So for example, civil society will be the advocates. They'll be the ones who simplify concepts. I mean, apart from the cartoonists, they'll be the ones who simplify concepts, but they're also the ones who can, engage at that high level, but they don't have access, right? So if you're a politician, then you have access, but perhaps you're less informed. So it's important for us to network with the people who have the power. You need to connect the people who have the power and the will with the ones who have the knowledge base. Then if you look at the role of investigative journalists, right? Now, I know investigative journalists in Sri Lanka feeling pressure not only to break the story, but also to convince other people to take action around it. And that is very sad because Their role is just to do that, and it is up to us to take it and run with it. And often we fail to do that. So I think that is also a vital part of what civil society needs to do. Now, if you look at the likes of hashtag generation, right? Even as an example, if we think of the upcoming elections and the campaign financing law, right? So what the law provides for is 21 days after the election results are announced, each candidate party or independent group needs to give their income and expenses in an affidavit form to the election commission. And within 10 days of that, the election commission needs to announce to the public that these are available for people to come and look at. Now, if an organization were to make it their mission to access all of that information, simplify it, put it on an online platform, make it cross-comparable, because our law doesn't provide for it. We are resource strapped. The state is resource strapped. But if some of us were to do that, then you can ensure accountability. There are creative ways in which those can be mapped against asset declaration information, right? That is already publicly available, some of which is already publicly available. So there is a lot that can be done. And it's, as Upeksha said, we really need to be creative about this and anchor ourselves where our skill sets can be most useful. Because as Dr. Aryaratan said, there is a role for everyone, for the professionals. Each person who is in that kind of research and the protest movement, each person has a role, and some of it might be just to amplify what others are saying with social media. So how do we connect those people who don't mind sharing information, who are influencers, who have a good following, with the right information? So that was a lot of disparate thoughts, but all points of action. Thanks.
Thank you, Sankita.
I will share one thought that following up from Sankita. Uh, though we are thinking that we need masses for change, we should not never underestimate the power of the one. Isn't it, Sandhyaka? And the young man who is sitting behind Sandhyaka, who stood before the Independence Day decorations, a lone protester. So, as Sankita said, each of us has to really think hard that what is our role as a citizen. And it has to go beyond being a civil society professional, right? It has to go beyond a voice at the social media. It has to go beyond sharing an interesting post. How we have to really think, how should we manifest that democracy and what we are preaching into our day-to-day life beyond elections?
Thank you. Much has been said, but I'll just raise two issues. In this year, we are going to see an election, more laws that at least the government has said they're going to introduce, and possibly great uncertainties. So in that context, and that's a very simplified version, what is our role going to be? Now, already the government has said they're going to introduce a national security law, media regulations that could potentially restrict freedom of expression and other rights. I mean, these are just things that is in the public domain. Think about what is going to be our role in this. And what we have seen in the last couple of months, at least, has been more awareness, challenging, critiquing, a greater debate. That is critical. Hashtag and other entities, individuals have such a key role in asking, why do we need a national security law? What does this entail? Who is going to be in it? What kind of powers are going to be there? I mean, just an example. What is this social media regulations the government is talking about? What is that going to have in terms of impact on social media? How would this impact our ability to access information? I've been watching the audience, many are on their smartphones and looking at things. Would this get impacted? I think these are questions one need to ask in terms of any law, policy, regulation this government is going to be putting out there. In terms of, I think, elections, and Sankita's point, now we have a law, however imperfect it is, in terms of campaign finance. Using that in asking questions about elected representatives or even, candidates. Asking the question why out of the 225 members of parliament, only a handful have actually publicly shared their asset declarations. What is the big secret here? Why is it such a difficulty in terms of elected representatives sharing this information? The whole issue of stolen assets that are outside the country. This was a big slogan last year. We need to ask these questions in a time of a crisis. These are important questions to ask. The other dimension is, while we have these conversations in social media, in Colombo, let's also not forget some of these questions, some of the injustices, inequalities have been faced by communities that don't always have the luxury of being heard. How do we connect with them? What about the victims, the families of the disappeared who've been protesting for over 2,000 days? What about the protests in Batticaloa, the justice walk that has been going on for so long? What about the land grabs? What about the militarization? What about the farmers who've been protesting? So there are different layers of inequalities, injustices that need to be questioned, challenged, and it shouldn't just be in Colombo. And one of the things that the Aragale, or the reawakening of the citizen race, was that we saw firsthand that people were able to push back on a corrupt governance model, on inequalities, on injustices, but it shouldn't be just limited to what we are able to access in Colombo. It needs to go beyond. And some have actually made that transition, but I think that transition needs to go much beyond, because let's face it, while we talk about economic crimes this year and last year, there are many others who've been trying to raise the issue of injustices, of enforced disappearances, of extrajudicial killings for decades. And because of that impunity is what has made us live this experience. So at the heart of everything is impunity. We need to question, critique, challenge that. And how we do that shouldn't be in our own bubble or in our own siloed approach. It needs to be much bigger. And there are many in this room, Sandha and many others, who've been doing this for years. And I think it's also important for us to be humble enough to also reach out to those who've been doing it for so many years and recognize some of it has been effective but may have not got the same attention. So what do we also learn from what has been done before? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhavani. I think we can have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm sure there's many. Sorry, we're just getting your mic. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, wow. So yeah, my question would be for Sankita and Upakshi. So Sankita, you mentioned that there is at least a perceived openness, increased openness on the part of the government for engagement with civil society when it comes also to passing of laws. You mentioned it with the anti-corruption bill. And I was wondering, since, correct me if I have my information wrong, both Transparency International and PAFREL were part of the organization that released the declarations criticizing the shortcomings of the new campaign finance bill. So I was wondering if you had any hopes that in the future you could be involved in a sort of revision also, I mean, keeping into account that if I'm not mistaken, it was challenged at the Supreme Court. So in a sort of revision of the, shortcomings and the loopholes that you were mentioning of the bill, or if you think that, now it's pretty much set in stone.
Do you want to start with it?
Yeah, maybe. So I didn't catch your name though.
My name is Christiana. I'm with the EU delegation. Thank you.
Christina, as we experience in Sri Lanka, not even the constitution is set on the stone. So it has been many amendments and repeals and so on. So, but saying that, we should not disregard what we have, the campaign finance bill. It has many loopholes, it has many corrections, but it is a start. So since the election is coming, and I think we are engaging with hashtag with this, we have to use what we have, and we have to use it in a way that when the recommendations, when the revisions are coming, we will have a scientific and research-based recommendations and solutions for the questions that we would have enacting this law. So definitely there will be recommendations, and we will be lobbying for that. And we will use this election as a basis or a baseline survey, if you may, for whatever sentences that they have left out.
So what's interesting is the same ministry that opened up the anti-corruption bill to us was also the ministry that rushed through the campaign finance bill. Even though we were still asking for that level of consultation. And I think PAFRL, with consultation with the other civil society organizations were the first to draft a law on campaign financing, a model law on campaign financing as far back as 2017. Was it 2017? And following which, civil society organizations managed to get access to that draft law. And for the past 5 years have been advocating for improvements. And then suddenly a completely different bill gets gazetted and passed. And thankfully it was challenged before the Supreme Court, and therefore significant improvements were made. So in terms of what we're looking at in the future, we will definitely continue to advocate for change and for better enforcement. Now, for example, to give you something concrete, what the currently passed law provides is if someone violates the requirement to disclose income and expenditure, that the offenses in the existing election laws will apply, and that's a 300 rupee fine or an imposition of civic disability for a period of 3 years, for a period of 3 years. That is less than an electoral cycle. So this is what we say. Apart from all the good provisions, what's the point if the sanctions are not strong enough, especially in a weak law enforcement system that we operate in? So what we can do there is an action point there, which is recently the Minister of Justice mentioned that they're going to amend the election laws for some other cosmetic reason. So we could use that opportunity also to try and increase the fines for these violations. So there are concrete things we can do going forward as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question from our audience on Facebook. I'm just going to direct that. Before that, I think
Yes, of course.
මම මගේ ප්‍රශ්නේ සිංහලෙන් තමයි ඔබට යොමු කරන්නේ. ම්, අ, අපි මෙතන කතා කළා දැන් වසන්ත මුදලිගේව PTA යටතේ රඳවා තියාගෙන නිදහස් කර ගැනීම සම්බන්ධව අපි දන්නවා තව ගොඩක් අය PTA යටතේ හිරගත වෙලා ඉන්නවා කියලා. අපේ අධිකරණ වලට ශක්තිය තියේද ඒ අයවත් නිදහස් කරන්න නැත්නම් අපේ නීතිඥ ප්‍රදාව සූදානම්ද ඒ අය නිදහස් කර ගැනීමට සහ අපිට තියෙන වැඩපිළිවෙල මොකද්ද වසර ගණන් PTAට හිරගතව ඉන්න දෙමළ සිරකරුවන් නිදහස් කර ගැනීමට ඒක පළවෙනි ප්‍රශ්නය. ඒ වගේම යුක්තිය සොයන මිනිසුන් වෙනුවෙන් උතුරේද දකුණේද ලංකාව පුරාම අපිට විශේෂ වැඩපිළිවෙලක් තියේද ඉදිරියට යන්න යුක්තිය ලබා ගැනීම වෙනුවෙන්. ඊළඟ එක අපි දන්නවා කොහොම අපි කතා කළත් ලංකාවේ මිනිසුන් දේශපාලන සාක්ෂරතාවයේ අතින් බිඳුවේ සිටිනවා. මේ සමාජ මාධ්‍යෙන් ඔබට ගිහිල්ලා මේ දේශපාලන සාක්ෂරතාවය ගමේ ඉන්න මිනිසුන්ට ලබා දෙන්නට අපි සූදානම්ද ඒකට අපිට තියෙන වැඩපිළිවෙල කුමක්ද? මම කරු විගත් සභාවේ සියලුම දෙනාට මේ ප්‍රශ්න යොමු කරනවා.
Shall I just quickly also give Sandhya questions තුනක් තියෙනවානේ ඒ තුනෙන් sorry she asked 3 questions. One you have translations, okay. So basically I'll take maybe first 2. Sandhya wage question එක අර judiciary එකෙන් අනිත් cases වලට එහෙම යුක්තියක් හම්බ වෙයිද? As a lawyer, I will say this. We have seen many, and I raised this point, languishing to get justice for decades. I would say what happened yesterday is remarkable, but also I would say it's a rare occurrence where we see this kind of measure by the judiciary. But I will also raise this question in terms of what happened with Vasanta's case. He was arrested in August last year, August 2022. He was discharged from the PTA case only yesterday. He faces other cases. How long does it take for the state, for the judiciary to look into a case? And if there's no evidence to discharge a person, and Vasanta got lucky, I will say. There are many others for decades who've been arrested, detained under the PTA who haven't had that luxury. And if people are not aware of it, that is also an indicator as to where we stand as a country. Because it shouldn't be an individual who is arrested wrongly, charged wrongly in the South for us to realize these issues. Political prisoners, specifically minorities, have had to face the brunt of this for decades. Easter Sunday, Muslims were arrested in large numbers, and questions are still remaining as to why they were arrested and detained. So Sandhyaගේ ප්‍රශ්නේ මං හිතන් පිළිතුර මේ වගේ case එක මං හිතන්නේ ඇත්තටම rare. There are many others who don't have that luxury. The other one about justice on the whole goes back to another question or issue I raised about the impunity. Now we are talking about economic crimes this date because the economic situation has made people realize there are huge issues of mismanagement that has resulted in this crisis. But how many ask the question in terms of the violations that occurred for decades in this country under successive governments by non-state actors? So it's not just governments, but non-state actors. And so there was a denial that led to impunity. That impunity has got us into this situation now because individuals contested elections not so far ago on the premise that they will give us security, economic prosperity, and safety. And a huge mandate was given. No questions asked about their own track record on violations, on corruption, on nepotism. Are we willing to now question those individuals, those who are part of the political elite that has got us into this situation? Therein lies the whole issue of democracy in this country. And that's a hard question we need to ask. Justice across Sri Lanka is treated, is addressed in different ways. And as citizens, as those active on social media, are we now going to step beyond our comfort zone and ask those hard questions? There's a few of us who've been doing it have been called traitors, terrorists, all sorts of names. Are we willing to change that narrative now? That national security should not mean you get a free pass. That being the executive president of this country doesn't mean you get a free pass. So I think Sandhya's questions are relevant in different ways, but the easy answer would be that if we don't confront impunity, we are not going to address the crisis that's confronting Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much, Bhavani, for that answer. And thank you, Sandhya, for your questions. I think we have one last question in the back.
Hi, good morning. My name is Shashain Fernando and I'm from IFS Sri Lanka. So I would like to direct this question to the learned panel. Actually, Dr. Vinya touched on this point. I'm asking this question as a youth representative of this country. Doctor, I think we all agree that Sri Lanka has a messed up governing structures and systems, and we have overcrowded officials. And also, we have the central government, we have the subnational governments, and we have provincial councils. And though we don't like to quote the word federal, we practice federal, certain federal systems as well. So why can't we bring out a comprehensive, national governing body, which is effective and efficient for Sri Lanka? I think most of these problems and even the crisis we face is due to this, I believe, because it's just when even in a company or an organization, if the message don't come down in a very systematic way, I think we are facing problems. Because I know for a fact, even for investments that brought for Sri Lanka, to the central government give the approval from the BOI, but when they come down, they will be obstructed by the provincial council because they have the authority over lands. So I would love to hear from the panel about a very effective or what is efficient for Sri Lanka. Or do you have any suggestions on that? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Sorry, Doctor. I think there's one other question. Yes. If you could raise it very quickly.
Hi, thank you. I'll ask my question very quickly. My name is Saturanga and I represent the UNDP. The question is to PAFRL and to TISL. If CPA and Sarvodaya can also answer, it would be nice. But the question is to take off from something that Mrs. Eknaligoda also mentioned, political literacy of the citizenry. And some of the social media trends that we've been seeing, especially in run-up to elections in the past, is that there is, to a very large degree, the spread of misinformation and disinformation targeted at certain groups. And now we are talking of a generation where we've seen the Aragalaya, seen the youth activism at a very good level in the country in 2022. And we are also talking of people who are able to sort of differentiate what's what to a certain degree on social media. Is that trend where I discussed this with Bhavani just before we started today, of people resorting to almost jokes against certain parties in a bid to sort of disorient the people from the actual objective. My question is this: when we take a look at all the trends that we have seen in the past, now given the fact that there is an increased attention towards social media, misinformation and disinformation in the country, would we see a difference in the trends that we see this year if the election is actually held? Or will it, in your opinion, be the same as the in relation to the amounts that are spent, the information that we see? Will there be a different, or will it be the same, is the question.
Thank you. I think those are two very loaded questions. So perhaps we can start with Dr. Vinya.
Yeah, I'll answer the first question.
Sure.
Then. So basically, to answer the question, what form of a governance system should be ideal for the country, I think is a very difficult question to answer. But I'll look at some of the principles. I think for me, centralization of power in whatever the form is not the way to go forward, even in the name of having efficiency. It doesn't improve efficiency. I mean, we know governance models where there's a lot of devolution, but you also improve efficiency. Certain state functions like defense and foreign affairs and monetary policy and all that probably will have to be centralized. But I am a firm believer of devolved governance systems, even beyond or below, going beyond local government. We believe in what you call Gram Swaraj, village self-governance systems. And that's really a good answer also for some of the economic problems that we are having, because a lot of markets can be also controlled by the people themselves at a devolved level. Then having the local government system depoliticized. Again, as I mentioned earlier, taking the party politics out of the local government system and the real community leaders to be contesting and then having governing councils, local government councils, which are more accountable to the people. I don't think at the moment, revamping the provincial council system, it's a very delicate thing, having a lot of implications to, ethnic problem and all issue and all that. So, but I think we definitely need a conversation on a kind of governance system, and a new constitution is a must for Sri Lanka. I stand by that, and for that to happen, I think there have been initiatives, and there are also some youth initiatives looking at a different system of governance. So I think it's not straightforward to see, okay, this type of governing system will make the country more efficient and accountable, but it's a combination of so many structures and institutions which need to work in harmony, in coordination. Of course, the basic principles of democracy, where there is an executive, legislature, and the judiciary, those basic elements need to be there in whatever the form that we talk of, because I don't think there are any other broad democratic principles that we could adopt. But then there are good examples, even from India, of devolved governance, like the panchayat system, which will be very effective. And also such devolved governing systems can withstand even economic shocks and then address the needs of the people. When you have devolved structures, they'll be responsible to make sure that all the children in that area goes to school, that they are not starving, and there's no pollution in those areas. So there are good examples around the world, both in high-income countries and low-income countries, where an alternative forms of governance, where there's power devolved to a micro level, is efficiently working, and also having information communication systems to link those and even link with markets. And we have seen, young entrepreneurs who are based in districts who are producing certain things for the export market, and there's enormous potential. So I think we can't just take out governance systems, but look at economics and social dimensions as well, and we can come up with a new system to govern Sri Lanka, which can also lead to a new constitution, and that's my hope as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinya. Bhavani?
Very quickly, I'll try to take both, but very quickly in terms of governance model, the conversation, and I agree with Vinya in terms of fully devolving and this devolution of power. Let's remember when we talk about full implementation of 13th Amendment. I mean, we're having we're talking about implementing part of the Constitution that was introduced in the 80s. But while we talk about a governance structure, and I'll be very upfront, I think we need to think about the F word, federalism. That's been there for so long. This is the time to have the conversation. Unfortunately, we get stuck in the politics and we can't move beyond. So let's leave aside these labels and think about how do you bring power closest to the people? What's the best model? And do that without getting stuck in the politics, the rhetoric. And getting a new constitution, yes, very good, but let's also remember what happened in the 2015-2016 cycle, all those attempts and lessons learned. But one thing I will say in terms of any governance reforms, and when it comes to democracy, is two areas we need to, and we've been talking about, is corruption and competence. We can have the perfect systems if we can't address those. So in a way, it's thinking about the larger reforms, but also making sure those reforms deliver to the people. The right people are in those places. And that's going to be the hard one, is how do you address it? Because some of it is so entrenched. The corruptions particularly, and the complacency, how do you address that? And so those things need to be thought about while we think about the reforms. Now, Chaturanga, your question, and I'll give Sangeeta, I mean, they'll be able to come in on this as well. But in terms of what we're likely to see this year, in terms of not just misinformation, disinformation, but also factoring the potential of incitement that is going to be there. And I'll just say this. Already in January alone, we have seen so much misinformation around the candidates. And I'm not going to name parties or individuals, but just those who are not even considering contesting have suddenly realized they are in someone's poster. That, in a way, is being mischievous. But the more dangerous elements are when what we've seen in the past with the Alutgama violence, the Digana violence, the post-Easter Sunday violence, the potential of misinformation, disinformation, how it can be weaponized to target communities, individuals, the most vulnerable. And not just during election cycles, it could be used as something that is a distraction. If the government is not able to deliver on their promises, what kind of distractions could come about? So I would say, as those using social media, citizen mobilization, there's a great responsibility in looking at how things worked or was used in the past, was weaponized in the past, and making sure there are checks in that. And social media, I think, has a key role in self-regulation and responsibility. We couldn't talk about it in this panel, but that's such a critical role that we also need to be responsible. And how do we also address that?
Yeah, I'll just quickly answer the question around social media. I think there are a couple of other panels dealing with social media as well. So, I mean, it's not my expertise, but from what we've observed and the research that has been done, there is a deliberate weaponization of social media for the purpose of elections. And this is done through, bot accounts, through concerted multiple admin accounts that are putting out information at exactly the same time that then just in turn gets shared as if it's organic, as if these are organic posts. Now, so that we expect to be deployed this time as well. Now, of course, we have a more politically conscious and sensitized youth right now who would understand that disinformation exists for a start and that you're probably being duped. But I don't think that generation can overtake those that believe this kind of disinformation in time for it to have any kind of impact on this election. So we'll see social media being weaponized quite effectively. Something that gets thrown into this mix is that the campaign finance law that was just passed actually seeks to regulate social media spending as well. So that what that means is, if someone is spending as a candidate, political party or independent group on social media, or someone is doing that on their behalf, that should be disclosed to the Election Commission. So even technically the Mada Prahara or something being done against opposing candidates, which is promoting a particular candidate, should be disclosed. But that is unlikely to happen given the difficulty of regulating third-party spending on a particular candidate. So I'll just leave it at that.
Continuing from what Sankita said, we have to understand this is a local government election, not a national election. So the things that we have to discuss and things we have to take into account when we are selecting our representative is limited to our own locality. We have to understand that, and we have to be cautious that we shouldn't make this as a national election where the people are voting for a certain party depending on national opinion, not for their own locality. So we are conscious about the disinformation and misinformation, but what we can do is, what we are doing is giving people tools, simple tools that can gauge your representative and the parties they represent. If the parties are promoting national level issues and crises, they are fueling the crisis, then of course the parties they represent, the representatives has to be taken into account. On the other hand, we are talking about the Game politician who will be representative, who will be responsible for your roads and welfare and children's malnutrition. So on that account, we have to educate the voters to take into account what is really important. Though we are promoting go and vote, it is really important that we know what we are voting for. If we are voting for constitutional change, or if we are voting for national unity, this is not the election to vote that. But we can, this is a base for elections to come. But the voters has to be aware of what they are voting for.
Thank you, Pekshi. With that, we've actually elapsed the time for this panel discussion. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to the audience. Great timing. I think there's an electricity glitch. Yes, that's lights out on this panel. Thank you so much, everyone, and also our audience joining on Facebook. Thank you so much.